Beginnings and endings are very strange things. In one sense, they're the very opposite of one another, and yet in another, they share a strange kind of identity. The lemon of the home is simultaneously the entrance and the exit of the house, and it's no wonder that many cultures spend a great deal of magical attention on this very portal. And it's here that we find ourselves at the very lemon of the year, at the very end of 2020 and at the beginning of 2021, entering the month of the two-headed god of Janus, the month of January. Of course, Janus was the Roman god of beginnings and endings, of gates, of the rising and falling tide of war, and of course of both the past and the present. And here we find ourselves, looking back into the past of 2020 and peering, though dimly, into the future of 2021. With this liminal attitude in mind, what better esoteric text to explore than the wonderfully paradoxical text, Thunder, Perfect Mind? Found in the famous Nag Hammadi Library, containing one of our greatest treasure troves of Gnostic literature, Thunder is a text all unto itself. It defies literary, logical, gender, and theological categories, and revels in vertigo-inducing paradox. So, to help me celebrate this liminal time of the year, I hope you'll join me as we explore this fascinating text. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. As you may know, the Nag Hammadi Library consists of 13 codices, or books, that were discovered in 1945 in Egypt. The books themselves were probably hidden sometime in the 4th century to preserve them, despite the fact that they were probably considered heterodox at the time. And generally speaking, they contain dozens of texts that scholars now reluctantly refer to as Gnostic in character. I'll be doing an upcoming episode on just why scholars are increasingly reluctant to use the term Gnostic to describe many of these texts, although at this point I'll be using Vanderbroek's Typology to better help us as a starting point for understanding this term. Of course, non-Gnostic texts were also recovered in the Nag Hammadi Library, especially in Codex 6, and this would include sections from Hermetic philosophy, along with sections from Plato's Republic, and some other sections from a hitherto unknown spiritual philosophy. And it is in Codex 6 that we find the hymn poem, Thunder, Perfect Mind. The title, which is preserved in the Codex, is rather mysterious, Tavrante nous enteleos, Thunder, Perfect Mind. Although it's strange, the word thunder only appears in the title, and the word nous, or mind, while incredibly important in many other texts to be found in the Nag Hammadi Library, only occurs a couple of times in the poem. So just how the title relates to the poem itself is again pretty mysterious. As I mentioned earlier, it's also in Codex 6 that we find the lion's share of non-Gnostic literature in the Nag Hammadi Library, including fragments of Plato's Republic, some Hermetic documents, including a Hermetic Thanksgiving hymn, the authoritative teaching, which it's not clear exactly how that document relates to other so-called Gnostic literature. So it seems that even the compilers of the Nag Hammadi Library didn't know quite what to do with Thunder. It seems to exist both inside and outside the library at the same time. So even in its day, Thunder was a liminal document. So what is Thunder, Perfect Mind? In the original manuscript, it's a roughly 8-page hymn poem spoken in the first-person feminine preserved in the Coptic language. As you probably know, Coptic is the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written in Greek characters, with several characters taken from the Demotic script to help with certain Egyptian sounds. The poem takes the form of an extended monologue, typically structured around statements like, I am X, and also I am not X, or I am the opposite of X. And despite its brevity and apparent simplicity, it is positively stunning what the poet is able to accomplish given this format. Thunder generally takes the form of an erotology, which are poems recounting the miraculous deeds or awesome power of the gods. We have various erotologies that have survived from the ancient world, including a very interesting one about the goddess Isis. A similar kind of genre can also be found in the ancient Near East as well. For instance, the personification of Sophia, or Chokmah, or wisdom, in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the book of Proverbs and in the text of Ecclesiasticus. However, thunder uses a kind of paradoxical inversion to subvert the category of erotology itself. Here, not only is the divine feminine being awesome, just, and wise, but they are also debased, humiliated, and the subject of extreme violence. Indeed, violence is a major trope of Thunder Perfect Mind, with over 24 mentions, roughly half of which do not receive literary reversals. Further, it's the audience themselves that are often implicated in that very violence against the divine feminine of the poem. While the overall character of the poem appears in the feminine voice, Thunder goes to great lengths to invert and subvert the gender of the speaker. The poem seems to delight in combinations of anoch te, I am he, and anoch pe, I am she, in which gender expectations are met, reversed, and subverted continuously throughout the course of the poem. The composer of the text seems to be using paradox as a means by which to break free of the constraints of gender itself. Further, the poem uses a wide range of literary structures, including paradoxical parallelisms, logical inversions, and tongue-twisting phonetic combinations that are in fact only to be found in Coptic. This indicates that perhaps the text was originally written in that language rather than being a translation from Greek, much like the rest of the literature to be found in the Nag Hammadi Library. Further, there's good reason to believe the text was meant to be performed. It often addresses its hearers, or audience, as opposed to its readers. The idea is that we, the audience, are directly interpolated into the text. And so here we have the idea that this was actually meant to be sung or performed in some kind of way. So to what degree can we consider this text Gnostic? Well, one way of asking that question is if we were to find Thunder Perfect Mind in a non-Nag Hammadi context, would we have any reason to believe this text was connected to Gnosticism? And the answer, frankly, is not really. For instance, in Thunder Perfect Mind, we don't see the elaborate kind of origin myth, specifically the myth of evil, as it's worked out in either Valentinian or other kinds of Sethian texts like the Apocryphon of John. If you're interested in texts like that, I've actually already done a video on the Apocryphon of John, which goes into a great deal of this so-called Gnostic mythology. If you're interested in that, you can click the card above to check out that episode. Despite this, some early scholars thought that the speaker of the text might be the kind of mother deity Barbelo, or the Sophia characters to be found in the Sethian Gnostic mythology. However, given the very enigmatic character of Thunder Perfect Mind, it's very difficult to say conclusively that could be true. Perhaps a better guess might be that the enigmatic speaker of Thunder is in fact a kind of spiritual Eve, or we have some good reason to believe that at least ancient writers thought this was the case. We have some reason to believe that because there are two other texts in the Nag Hammadi Library, both found in Codex II, which seem to reference or quote Thunder Perfect Mind. One of those is on the origin of the world, and the other is on the reality of the rulers, sometimes translated as on the hypostasis of the archons. Both of these texts seem to be quoting from Thunder Perfect Mind and putting those quotations into the mouth of Eve, or Chava, life, in the Gnostic version of the Garden of Eden story. Although it's possible that the text Thunder Perfect Mind was generated completely separately and simply interpolated into those texts, or that both Thunder and the quotations used in those two texts come from an earlier source. We just don't know. But at least in some sense we can say that the writers or the compilers of the Nag Hammadi Library would have understood the speaker of Thunder Perfect Mind to be a kind of primordial Eve. Although, as I mentioned earlier, it's still not quite clear what relationship Thunder Perfect Mind has to do with the rest of the text to be found in the Nag Hammadi Library. Despite these references in on the origins of the world and on the reality of the rulers, there's nothing in Thunder Perfect Mind to really indicate the kind of Gnostic soteriology or salvation story. Even terms like nous, mind, or gnosis, knowledge, the kind of salvific knowledge that we associate with Gnosticism, really aren't to be found in a very robust way in Thunder Perfect Mind. In fact, the speaker claims to have them and then instantly disclaims having them. So if it is the case that gnosis, or knowledge, is meant to be the salvific tool in Gnosticism, the speaker of the text will claim to be both mindful and mindless at the same time. So just how this paradoxical relationship of having these dual inverted traits is meant to relate to the so-called Gnostic soteriological story is far from clear. So, while other texts tend to quote Thunder, Thunder seems to stand alone. And further, even concepts like monism and dualism, of course Gnosticism is typically associated with dualism, a kind of dislike or a disdain for physical reality. it seems that we don't even find those ideas to be found in thunder also. The paradoxical structure at work in the very logic of the text itself seems to destroy concepts like monism and dualism, inhabiting both and neither at the same time. And even the text at the end, which seems to speak of a kind of salvation, were actually added later as a kind of a Christian interpolation to remove the danger of the paradoxes here. There's something about the paradox which causes us to worry about the text, or it induces a kind of philosophical anxiety for us. And perhaps a Christian later came along later and resolved those paradoxes toward the end of the text, whereas I think the text itself simply reveled in that paradoxical reality. So the text itself seems to be free of many of the parameters or boundaries we would like to force it into, whether they be Gnostic, Hermetic, Christian, or Egyptian, or even the kind of Middle Platonic or Middle Stoic ideas that would have been common at the time of the composition of the text. None of these really capture the dynamism and strangeness of Thunder Perfect Mind. Of course, the author of the text remains a complete enigma, although I do think dating it to the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era seems reasonable, and it seems likely to me that the composer of the text is either a woman or a gender non-conforming person. Further, I think the text was not only originally written in Coptic, but I think that the person writing it may have had a very love-hate relationship, especially with the Greek side of the Greco-Egyptian culture of that time. One of the interesting things about the identity of the author is that they self-proclaim themselves to be a barbarian, perhaps an Egyptian barbarian, and the idea that a person would self-identify as a barbarian is simply unimaginable in the Greek world. Given this, along with the propensity of the text to describe a great deal of violence, one is left with a sense that there's a kind of post-colonial hybridity at work in the text, described by scholars like Homi Bhabha. Although again, the exact identity of the author remains mysterious to us. We simply don't know who composed Thunder Perfect Mind, and we likely never will. While thunder is exceptional in the Nag Hammadi Library, typologically similar texts can be found even in other Christian literature. For instance, the hymn of Jesus found in the apocryphal Acts of John is remarkably similar to thunder. And further, and I think even more important, is a Mandean text to be found in the Genza Rabbah. Of course, the Mandeans are incredibly important in this conversation because they are the last surviving Gnostic remnant from antiquity. Further, there's even parallel literature to be found in this I am not structure, for instance, as far afield as Indic literature in the Upanishads, in the Athara Veda, and also in the Gita itself. Perhaps the most shocking version of this kind of typology, at least in the history of Western esotericism, can be found in the Angel Diaries of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. On May 23, 1587, Dee and Kelly, toward the very end of their career together, come in contact with an entity referring to itself as the Daughter of Fortitude, and that spirit or entity gives a speech remarkably similar to Thunder Perfect Mind. What's conspicuous about the speech given by the Daughter of Fortitude is not only its parallels to Thunder Perfect Mind, but also the intense sexual nature of the speech. Of course, this follows only a month after the infamous wife-swapping incident between Dee and Kelly. Just what to do with these typological parallels isn't clear, but one has to admit that they are, at times, a bit uncanny. Of course, thunder continues to make itself felt both academically and artistically, with it being set to music several times, it being referenced by Toni Morrison and Umberto Eco, it appearing in the film The Daughters of Dust, and perhaps oddly enough, in the long-form advertisement for Prada perfume directed by Ridley Scott. The same guy that directed Gladiator and Alien has also put Thunder Perfect Mind to a Prada ad? Okay. I strongly suspect that after having been lost for nearly 1600 years, Thunder Perfect Mind is well on its way to becoming a new kind of classic. If you're interested in Gnosticism, Hermetic philosophy, or mysticism, make sure to subscribe here to the channel. These are all core content areas here at Esoterica. And further, if you'd like to support my work of making free, accessible, and scholarly content available on YouTube on topics in esotericism, please consider supporting my channel on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Your support makes Esoterica possible. Thank you. Of course, my brief introduction to Thunder Perfect Mind here is by no means a substitution for reading and deeply studying the text on your own, and I'll include several links in the description for various translations that you can access online. Also, I'll include the link to that weird product commercial where you can see it being performed, I guess, in the interest of selling perfume, so Hooray, capitalism. No, just in case you're wondering, that was sarcasm. At any rate, the best and most complete study and translation of Thunder Perfect Mind available at this point is the 2010 edition by Taussig. This slim but expensive volume is really incredible. It covers thunder in a lot of different aspects, from poetry to historical context to Coptic grammar, and it produces a wonderful translation with the Coptic text facing, with an elaborate series of footnotes describing all the various nuances, both in the Coptic original and why they translate the text the way that they do. This little volume, which again is unfortunately expensive, is still the best study in the best translation of Thunder Perfect Mind available. Perhaps you can get it via ILL, but this volume, which I hope comes out in a less expensive paperback version at some point, is, to my mind, the single best text if you're going to really deep dive and get a deep appreciation of Thunder Perfect Mind. Well, here's to living at the moment of paradox, somewhere between the dumpster fire that was 2020 and the possibilities of 2021. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.